In the early days of the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, the most powerful military in the world was confident it would overwhelm the People's Army of Vietnam thanks to its decisive air superiority and comprehensive military strategy. And for a while, it seemed like they would. When several PAVN regiments launched a massive surprise attack on the U.S. military camp at Plei Me, the large-scale battle devolved into a brutal siege. The South Vietnamese troops soon arrived to help, and they soon managed to break the siege. The victors were ecstatic and ready to make the PAVN pay. Eager to test their new air mobility doctrine, in which they would use fast-moving helicopters to deliver troops where they were needed the most, the U.S. military soon gave chase to the retreating PAVN regiments. In a spectacular show of might and technical dominion, hundreds of U.S. helicopters darted above the jungle to deliver hundreds of men to designated landing zones, ready to deliver a swift and crushing blow to the enemy. But the Americans underestimated their opponent, and the ensuing Battle of Ia Drang would soon turn into a feverish nightmare that would bring the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division to its knees. Even worse, it would show the North Vietnamese how to defeat the Americans. The Siege of Plei Me. After years of indirect involvement in the Vietnam conflict, the U.S. decided the only way to achieve its goals in the region was to commit a significant number of troops to the war-torn country. Thus far, America had limited itself to providing supplies and training to the South Vietnamese troops, as well as the occasional operation led by U.S. Special Forces, but this approach was not proving effective. In 1965, the Department of Defense finally approved the incursion of the first complete U.S. division to enter Vietnam. The 1st Cavalry Division was tasked with providing full-fledged military involvement in the region, as well as introducing America's emerging air mobility doctrine. The 1st Cavalry Division was to be deployed to the Central Highlands region of Vietnam, a crucial staging area for whoever controlled it. The U.S. was confident in its new air mobility approach, which sought to use fast-moving helicopters to deploy troops across large distances in a short amount of time, striking the enemy right in their territory with no previous warning. However, PAVN strategists soon learned of the incoming attack and decided to capture the Central Highlands before the U.S. deployment was complete. If the whole cavalry division made it to the U.S. post of Plei Me, the entire region would easily fall into their control. Surprise attack. As the first units of the 1st Cavalry Division arrived at Plei Me, the Viet Cong launched an attack to take the U.S. by surprise. The limited number of American troops in the camp fought a fierce defensive battle against overwhelming forces. Thousands of PAVN fighters descended into the camp surrounding it and put it into an excruciating siege. The future of U.S. dominion in the region and the deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division hung in the balance as the Americans dug in to repel wave after wave of enemy onslaughts. Thankfully for the besieged troopers, when they called for air support, the U.S. 481st Tactical Fighter Squadron answered by delivering an unrelenting barrage of fire all around Plei Me, successfully crippling the attacking forces and stopping them from assembling large-scale assaults. However, the siege continued for several days, pushing the American fighters to the brink of depletion. They now had to wait for support from their South Vietnamese allies. Triggering the trap. General Nguyen Hue An had accounted for the relief efforts of the South Vietnamese and prepared for them accordingly. As such, the U.S. allies were suddenly ambushed by the 33rd PAVN Regiment and overpowered by a brutal night attack from enemy units hidden in the depths of the jungle. The South Vietnamese forces suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat, leaving the Americans in an even more precarious position. Even so, Nguyen Hue An did not trust the full might of his forces to take Plei Me camp, and they were routed again and again by American air support in the area. By October 25th, the South Vietnamese regiment had surrounded the enemy and successfully relieved Plei Me. Faced with the impossibility of taking the post, the PAVN regiments decided to retreat north and regroup. The U.S. had proved its overwhelming resolve and superior firepower, and like so many times in the past, its air dominion had saved the day. However, fueled by the excitement of the victory, the U.S. commanders took a decision that would cost them dearly. Call in the cavalry. While the 1st U.S. divisions continued being deployed into Vietnam, The US in South Vietnam carefully studied the movements of the 33rd and 66th PAVN regiments, which had fled north to regroup after their failure to take Plei Me. By November 14th, the PAVN regiments had completed their retreat and hunkered down in the northern region of the highlands, where they continued to build up their fortifications. The US designated 7 landing zones close to their positions, where they would land and immediately attack the enemy, right in the heart of what they considered safe territory. Following South Vietnamese intelligence that reported the position of the Viet Cong fortification, the US cavalry units decided to land the bulk of their forces on a clearing named Landing Zone X-Ray. Then, on November 14th, the first major air mobility operation in Vietnam was launched. Chaos ensued when the US forces learned that many of their helicopters were not operation-ready, and the limited Hueys that were working could only carry 5 troopers instead of the conventional 11 due to technical issues caused by the local weather. As such, they could only deliver 80 men every half an hour, and it would take over 3 hours to take the force of 430 troopers the operation called for. The delay, however, would leave the first waves wholly exposed as they awaited reinforcements. The US pressed on, regardless of the risks. The clash was preceded by a massive barrage of artillery fire, aerial strikes, and gunship fire at 10:40 a.m., preventing the enemy forces from orchestrating a spell as the Americans landed. Invaded by nervousness and uncertainty, the first US troops proceeded to unload their equipment and assume their positions, knowing full well that they were entirely surrounded by the enemy and could be ambushed at any moment. Fortunately, the enemy was not ready to resist the American onslaught when the landing began. Consequently, Bravo Company took advantage of the Viet Cong's lack of organization to launch a piercing attack into the enemy's defensive line. The thrust managed to push within 100 meters of the enemy's concentration position, but the increased number of PAVN fighters crippled the advance and pinned down the now thinly spread Americans. Then, just as the attack slowed down, Alpha Company arrived to bolster the American spearhead and continue with the offensive. Victory was possible, after all. Shifting tides. As the confident US forces prepared to make a final push into the enemy's stronghold, PAVN commanders approached the fray and swiftly rallied their troops to conduct a synchronized counterattack of crushing force. A hailstorm of mortar fire soon enveloped the American offensive, while infantry infiltrated close to the positions surrounding Bravo Company. The tables had been turned within minutes, with entire US platoons becoming lost in the chaos. At the same time, US leaders desperately called for more air support. They had lost contact with Bravo Company, leading to Alpha Company launching a hasty rescue operation to look for the missing men amid the chaos and bullet storms. The fighting became so intense and unpredictable that when US helicopters arrived to deliver more troopers, they were advised not to touch down in the smoke-covered clearing, as they could quickly be taken down by the barrage of fire. The 2nd platoon then became utterly isolated and engulfed by enemy troops. And to make matters worse, the area was almost impossible to defend. With no other options, the men crawled on their stomachs and resisted wave after wave of enemy assaults. Soon, the commander perished on the battlefield, and Clyde E. Savage took the lead in what was now a desperate fight for survival, while other US forces repeatedly tried to break the enemy encirclement and save their fellow soldiers. One of the survivors later recalled, quote, "There was no way we could dig a foxhole. The handle was blown off my entrenching tool, and one of my canteens had a hole blown through it. The fire was so heavy that if you tried to rise up to dig, you were dead. It was death and destruction all around." After several grueling hours, the enemy attacks finally decreased by nightfall. New dawn. Colonel Hal Moore requested more reinforcements as the fighting slowed down, and an additional company of exhausted US troops came to help. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong commanders were desperately trying to regroup their scattered forces to launch a counterattack that would grant them the final victory in the battle. As such, 66 regiments were ordered to launch a night attack on the American positions, but the depleted troops were in no condition to carry out the endeavor. Instead, both sides retreated to lick their wounds, with no way to continue the fight. The following day, the Americans awoke to fresh supplies and reinforcements, but also a series of fierce counterattacks. However, Operation Arclight had just been launched, deploying several B-52 shadow fortresses to deliver an unparalleled area bombardment that stopped the enemy from assembling any significant attack. The air support was a double-edged sword, however, as the highly volatile napalm payloads often engulfed friendly troopers. Even Moore's command post was struck. Despite the limited friendly fire, the troops on the ground were given a second wind by the fresh reinforcements and the massive air support, allowing them to launch a proper rescue operation to bring the 2nd Platoon home. Broken and reduced to a fraction of their former force, the men from the 2nd Platoon returned to the landing zone. And by November 16th, the Viet Cong regiments had been almost completely broken down in the face of unrelenting bomber strikes. At that point, their commander finally ordered them to stop trying to attack X-Ray and retreat. Once again, U.S. air superiority had evened the odds. Vicious ambush. After the Viet Cong retreated, the 2 battalions at X-Ray moved to the other clearings being used as landing zones. The exhausted Battalion 2-7 marched through the jungle to reach Albany, holding the area while unaware they were being watched. The 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment had spotted them as they cut through the jungle and were waiting to catch them by surprise in the perimeter around the barren landing zone. This time, the PAVN forces were determined to change their tactic by executing a lethal close-quarters ambush that would make it impossible for the U.S. to send air support. As the GIs reached the clearing and took a moment to rest, sudden bursts of machine gun and mortar fire rained upon them, taking the lives of countless soldiers before they realized what was going on. The Americans ran for a group of termite mounds, their only cover in the clearing, but they would find no respite. Covered by the lush forest, the North Vietnamese forces unleashed all their firepower, receiving little in return from the pinned-down American troops, who could not see most of their attackers. After suffering massive casualties, the 2-7 continued to hold, receiving a limited quantity of reinforcements that evening. Then, as the sunlight waned, the battle became a brutal series of ambushes. For the rest of the feverish nightmare of a night, the U.S. soldiers were hunted down endlessly, bringing the 2-7 Battalion to its knees. Aftershock. By the morning, the PAVN regiments were exhausted and low on supplies, so they finally retreated. Less than half of the 2-7 U.S. Battalion remained alive, while the PAVN forces suffered around 1,000 losses and 500 wounded. For them, it was a small price to pay for the real spoils they had attained, learning how to fight the Americans, while diminishing their air support advantage by keeping their attacks swift, sudden, and close to the enemy. North Vietnam would continue to use what they learned in the battle for the rest of the war, while the results led to the U.S. air mobility doctrine being put into question. Even against unmeasurably overwhelming air superiority, the ambush on 2-7 proved that the Vietnamese forces could severely punish American operations in the region. And they would. Thank you for watching Dark Docs. For more in-depth looks into some of the fiercest battles in modern warfare and the incredible weapons that shifted the tides of war, click on your screen and explore our other Dark Documentaries channels. We regularly publish new videos, so subscribe and stay tuned.